top U.S. health experts warn that up to 200,000 Americans could die from coronavirus. The president thinks that the elevation of Seoul, South Korea is really its population. And our Lord and Savior Bernie Sanders may be betting on a resurgence in popularity of his Medicare for All platform in the wake of the COVID-19 outbreak. We'll break it all down with our friend Susanna Luthi, a healthcare reporter at Politico, this week on the Amateur Hour podcast. Welcome to the Amateur Hour podcast. Today, we are going to talk with our friend Susanna Luthi, who is a healthcare reporter for Politico, and we're going to talk about some things that are going on with COVID-19 and the way in which it might be affecting healthcare in America. And we're also going to kind of talk about Bernie and whether or not he is still Jesus or whether his celestial calling is fading once and for all. So, I just read that we've had 23,000 new cases in the United States today. It's a lot of cases. As of this morning, it was at 160,000 with over 3,000 deaths. And so now we've sort of surpassed the 9/11 death toll today. And if you watch the press conference this afternoon, and again, this is Tuesday that we're recording this, although you will not listen to it until Wednesday probably. If you watch the press conference this afternoon, everyone's sort of talking about 100,000 to 200,000 deaths. And we can talk a little bit later, maybe if we want, about whether or not that actually makes any sense. But that is a lot of dead people in America. So despite the ratings, it's looking pretty gnarly. So we still have a primary election happening, although it seems kind of like years ago now that we cared about that, even though really it was only a few weeks.
Doesn't it?
Yeah. How long ago was it, Brandon, that Super Tuesday happened?
Oh gosh, I mean, I don't even know anymore, to be honest.
How many Scaramucci's ago was Super Tuesday?
Well, let's see. A Scaramucci is a sum of about 9 days, I believe. So 9 times, let's say, 4. Give it a month-ish, plus or minus.
It's like it equals 3 Avenattis.
I believe Avenatti equals 30 years to life at this point, but I'm not sure.
Well done.
Thank you.
Even though we've kind of gotten away, I think, from talking about the primary debate, it still seems to be super relevant in the sense that healthcare is kind of at the forefront of most of our minds, I'd imagine, since I don't know about you guys, but I am sort of terrified by COVID, even though I would like to think that I'm in good enough shape and still young enough to avoid the worst consequences. That doesn't seem to, I don't know, it doesn't give me much comfort. I don't know about you guys.
One thing I will say about COVID that I had to, I was talking to a friend about this, and I think our level of comfort with it is how willing we would be to, or how worried we are that our parents could be exposed. And that to me just tells me how worried I am about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
How are your parents doing? I know your parents. How are they doing?
They're doing well. They actually began self-isolating a week before the governor's orders. Thanks to Dr. Fauci. I sent them some very scary Dr. Fauci quotes. Very beginning of the month, or maybe even in February, and they locked themselves in.
I was actually talking with my dad last night about this in relation to other sort of nation-shattering or nation-altering moments in my lifetime. And the only other two that came to mind for me were September 11th and the 2008 mortgage crisis. And I think it's a big open question of how the world's going to be different, or how America is going to be different after we get through this. Will it fundamentally alter the way we work, the way we communicate with each other on a daily basis, our level of comfort, of physical comfort around each other, all this sort of things. Even stuff as simple as like permissiveness. Like, do you have to ask permission to shake somebody's hand instead of just extending your hand out of benevolence?
Well, and in some ways, it does almost feel like it's a combination of those two things, right? I mean, almost literally, 9/11 and the mortgage crisis. Mm-hmm. It is like a massive economic crisis and a massive health, a fatality crisis.
Except, I mean, I was in college, or as a freshman in college for 9/11, and yes, I remember that day very, very well. It was very vivid. And there was some fallout afterwards. It was scary. And going home from college for the first time that Christmas, airport restrictions that weren't there when I left. But this is creepy.
Yeah.
This is creepy.
It's less known, right?
In 2 weeks, we'll know how, whether I have it and whether I've killed people. It's a different feeling.
Very different.
Well, how old were you on 9/11?
It's 2.
Yes.
This is my generation's first kind of national tragedy or a real national crisis. And it's interesting how we're responding. At first, I don't think many in my generation took it very seriously. I think now they're getting better. But I was definitely in my friend group. I was the most knowledgeable about it, and I was definitely the most the person who was advocating the most for mitigating the spread. And I told people either go home or stay here. Do not go home and then come back. And a lot of people, for some reason, want to do that.
Yeah, and Walt and I were just talking about this right before we started, but we just got a email from the president of the university where I teach and where Walt is a student, telling people not to come back to get their stuff from the dorms, even though they sent out an email like 2 days ago telling people that they could come back and get their stuff from the dorms, which is, another symptom of the problem of people not taking this seriously early enough. It took forever for our particular university to actually get its shit together and come up with a plan. And every day it was sort of vacillating between all of these sort of what ifs. And I think people just went home for spring break and didn't, take their stuff. And now it's kind of a big mess. And I certainly don't want them all coming back from all regions of the United States to, pick up their PlayStations. Susanna, how are things out there? Just sort of, what is it like every day being in DC and working in the capacity that you're working?
Well, it's probably a lot like everywhere else because we've been working from home. This will be our 3rd week working from home. Yeah, 3rd week. Feels longer than that. But yeah, one day, and I remember the weekend before, Italy was getting bad. Italy was looking bad. It was a Sunday. And I texted 2 colleagues and I said, I bet this is the last week we work in the office. The next day or similar, people were saying, our editors said, if you're not comfortable coming in, don't come in. For those of you who travel, commute by metro. And then by Friday, we were mostly working from home, and then Monday officially. So, and then my first White House briefing with the, because the health reporters started coming in. I was at the first briefing where they took our temperatures. They did a fever check before we went in. And then now there's kind of a whole apparatus outside the White House before you can even go in the gate. There's a tent set up and you take your fever check. And then once you're inside the briefing room, it used to be that, it's very crowded. They limit how many people can go. And everyone they have spaced out seating. And people are wiping everything down. So that's been different, but that's pretty much the only place I've been outside the grocery store and taking walks. So it's been it's isolating, but one thing about covering it, which I think I'm lucky a lot of people don't feel, I think a lot of people feel not in control. And you just kind of don't have the time to feel not in control and you also you're chasing the story and this is the story. So I don't know, in a way, I haven't had the emotional reaction that a lot of my friends have had. And I guess because I feel so connected to it and you're caught up in it and you just don't have the time to really think about yourself too much.
Do you feel like people generally feel safe in those briefings, the way that's being handled from a health perspective? Because I know that, I always look at people sitting kind of staggered or, people having gloves on and taking the microphone, but still that microphone's going around, like in the Rose Garden, for instance, yesterday, they're handing the microphone between people and everyone on stage.
Oh, were they? Yeah, I actually wasn't there.
It's that thrilling.
I don't know.
But I mean, do you think that you think reporters are sort of feeling like they're, like you or other people, are you feeling like you're risking yourself, or do you feel genuinely like fairly comfortable with the health precautions that are being taken?
I'm comfortable with them, but it's tough every time you go somewhere. Like if I take a taxi to go down there, and it's just like every time I go to a store, I think about myself touching things that other people have touched. I don't know, like the day to day has changed, and like with the briefing room, for example, it's a very controlled environment. It's more as the days go by, I notice all the uncontrolled things a lot more.
Yeah, someone posted on Twitter yesterday or the day before. I may have shared it with you guys. I don't remember. And it just said, just got back from the grocery store and I feel like I've gone skydiving. Yeah, I don't know. I have literally left my house once in the last 23 days.
How do you get your food? Do you grow your own?
Yeah, we we make bread and we've got chickens. And actually Walt runs a startup for farm boxes and stuff. So I just signed up for that. But I saw this coming a while ago and stocked up, did the Costco prepper run. And I've got like something like 60 pounds of flour or something right now.
You can take the boy out of pasta, but you can't take pasta out of the boy.
Man, that is so true.
We know our doomsday prepping.
That's right.
I was curious, in your conversations recently with like policymakers around healthcare, have you seen any shifts in sort of ideological thinking at more kind of the fundamental level of how this stuff should be managed? Are there anything that surprised you from people that are in positions of power that could be shaping healthcare policy?
Not really. Not really. The changes, and we're not going to go into the weeds. So there are a lot of changes that are happening, but it's like wonky stuff. But it's things like, but it is stuff that will all make a difference. And I don't know how much the genie can go back in the bottle, but some things like insurance companies have to authorize before, a patient can be moved from one setting to another. Things like that are getting waived. The insurance companies aren't requiring to have to, put certain restrictions on. There are certain like one thing that's kind of big and it's only around testing is like waiving copays and deductibles around testing. But some people are still, so this is the public perception because this is being publicized. But some people, especially the uninsured, are still seeing big bills. And this is where I see some movement in the future, but policymakers definitely don't seem to be thinking about this yet. Job-based insurance as our health system at a time when everyone's losing their jobs. Now the numbers aren't projecting so high that it's making a difference, but it is a question I'm asking. At what point is a dip in job insurance, significant enough where people are, really want to make a shift away from job-based insurance? And that isn't, surprisingly, that's not just a liberal idea. Paul Ryan talked about making insurance portable. And it really isn't, because employer insurance is so expensive. And it's long been the place where both pharmaceutical companies and the hospitals make a lot of money. The entire healthcare system makes a lot of money because it's kind of like it can absorb all these costs and premiums get higher, but people don't really realize because they see it in tax deduction and it's taken out of their wages. They don't really see it. When they get laid off and they want to extend their insurance plan, keep their insurance plan, it's all of a sudden, $21,000 for a family. Who is laid off can afford that? So I do think down the road there will be some effects, but I've seen proposals like, let's just expand Medicare just for COVID coverage. If someone just have Medicare pay for it, then insurance all the tons of insurance companies don't have to figure out special policies, but hospitals don't want that because they don't want to be paid the lower Medicare rates. So that's not going to come up in Congress as a serious. I mean, maybe. I mean, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, has brought up some things about covering the uninsured. But when you really look at how the policies are going to interact, I don't know. But yes, I do think that down the line there will be some repercussions that policymakers may be forced to address. I'm not hearing a whole lot of difference from the status quo now, though.
Yeah, but it sounds like the kind of ideological kind of principles are still pretty much in place for the most part, with maybe some subtle, more technocratic shifts.
Yeah. So do you think that aside from, insurance companies, changing policies or politicians pushing them to do that, do you think, Susanna, that there will be a sort of movement once people realize how much their insurance is actually costing them, if they're getting kicked off of their plans because they're losing their jobs or what have you, or just that, for the first time in their lives, younger people are finding themselves very, very sick and having to go to hospitals, whereas they may never have done that before. Do you think that that is going to drive more people towards caring more deeply as voters about universal health care or something like that? I mean, I know a lot of young people already care about that sort of nominally, but do you think that this is the shift where people actually begin to get much more involved with that as their main political concern in ways that it hasn't been before?
That's a little outside my expertise because I'm not a good, I don't follow shifts and trends so much. I mean, I think I think you can kind of, as a blanket statement, say that younger people are more liberal on healthcare, and then they get into corporate jobs and they get their benefits. And then you have a Silicon Valley company that gives you in vitro fertilization as part of your health benefits. And are you going to give that up for, a very basic healthcare plan? So there are lots of I don't know. It kind of depends, I think, on how things progress, how many young people get sick and, potentially, bankrupted by these hospital bills, what the government does and fails to do. I will say what I am watching very closely, because I would say Democrats have been staunch defenders of the Affordable Care Act, which did leave a lot of people with, high deductibles and cost sharing and all of that. People are talking about, we're really seeing the holes in coverage now. We're really seeing you're covered, but not fully covered. At this point, the Affordable Care Act and its essential health benefits, which for full coverage, they go far beyond a single payer healthcare system somewhere else. It's very expensive insurance for a reason. So as long as that remains the Democratic platform, it's going to be hard to bring that into kind of a bigger discussion of single payer healthcare. What I will say though is if there's just a need for a broad safety net, why can't we all be on Medicaid and at least be able to go to a doctor and not be bankrupted? It'll be interesting. I mean, I'm watching as much as anyone else because I do think healthcare will change after this, but I'd say the two big things that I'm watching are, our system of high deductibles and copays, and then our job-based system at a time when the people with the best insurance get it through their job, and what happens when their job goes away. Will what happens next make our policymakers kind of think outside the box from how they've been thinking? I don't know.
If you look at Bernie Sanders' website right now, he's obviously trying to stay relevant, which is important for him. And there's been criticism, at least in the, Twitter universe, which again is not the real universe, but there's, plenty of people that I've seen complaining that, Biden isn't doing enough to get out there and engage on the issues in the way that Bernie's engaging on the issues. I tend to think that that's because people are just following the wrong accounts or something like that. I follow both Biden and Bernie, and I've seen both of them out there doing what they can. And obviously, and Brandon, you and I were talking about this earlier, they're both really, really old and in the highest risk group for, dying from coronavirus. So I don't personally want either of them out campaigning right now, and so I think that it's, maybe short-sighted for people to complain that they're not doing enough. But I guess one question that I had, and this can kind of be for anyone, but I'm wondering how much would really change even if Bernie did sort of get a little bit more of a boost off of, coronavirus, because more people are interested now in trying to figure out new ways to retain healthcare or new ways to obtain healthcare. If they're scared into feeling like, we're entering this new era where healthcare is going to be much more important than it ever has been. Does that really change much for Bernie? Because it seems like older people are the people who are the most affected by this, obviously. And so I feel like older voters, from what I've seen, are probably more likely to vote for Biden than they are for Bernie. Bernie has been continually kind of talking about how, it's the youth vote that's going to kind of bolster him. And we've seen also continually that those people don't show up to vote in very large numbers. So, I mean, even if we did move more towards like everybody needs a better healthcare option, do you think that voters tending to be older would lean more towards Biden, or do you think that they would kind of switch to the Bernie Medicare for all kind of thing? Or is it enough just to kind of update the ACA the way that Biden's been talking about?
I mean, I have one thought, and I think we'll see where it goes. But my sense is that we don't really know what the debate is going to be yet in come fall. I could see it going two ways. One, it could be about a national conversation about healthcare, and the other way could be the credibility of an administration's ability to respond to a national crisis and its ability to operationalize that and mitigate it or not mitigate it. And, whether it'll be about kind of deeming what the current administration has done as some sort of a success. I think right now it'd be tough to make that argument based on the early kind of failings to respond and achieve readiness, or whether it'd be better for a new administration that could come in and make a credible argument to say we can put experts in place to respond to science early, get out ahead of trends that we need to get ahead of, and also operationalize helping the states at scale. But yeah, I mean, I'd be interested in your perspective as well, Susanna.
Well, I think on this, you guys know more than me because I'm here where, honestly, as a healthcare reporter, I was wondering how many Medicare for All stories I'd have to write this year. I was not expecting to be very busy. And now the campaign reporters have nothing to do and the healthcare reporters are, swamped. So here right now, the campaigns aren't even the story, and I'm not even seeing campaigns much. It's kind of all now, and obviously the coming months will tell how much that changes, but it's hard to even remember a campaign is going on. So it'd be interesting to know I'm interested, you guys out there, are you guys talking about the campaign, or are you guys talking about Bernie versus Biden still?
From my perspective, I don't really think this whole situation swings in either Bernie or Biden's favor as far as healthcare goes. I think this crisis shows that there does need to be healthcare reform, and I think the health reform on the Democratic side will be healthcare for all, and Republican, it will be something else, whether that's cutting the healthcare budget, but it will be reform, I think, regardless over the next 4 years. So I don't think it swings either Bernie or Biden.
Well, I think that it just kind of depends on what people are looking for. And I would imagine by November, we are going to be looking for someone who can save the country in the short term over someone who has ideas for how to make things better 4 years from now after a long transition period.
I really don't think Bernie would have been able to deal with this situation because I don't think Trump has done any bit of a good job either, but there is a certain sense of capitalism that might save us from this, because the private sector is the part of our nation that will step up to prevent this from happening again. They will be the group that mitigates this. It's not government. It's not, I don't think a socialist side government would necessarily mitigate this any better. It needs to come from the private sector. And that's going to undoubtedly be incentivized by profit. And, that's not necessarily good, but that is the way that you motivate people to innovate and motivate people to protect their customers. And if everyone's dying in this country from coronavirus, then that's bad, right? That's bad for everyone. And I
think you've just answered your own question about whether Medicare for all will happen then, because the healthcare industry is very against it, and they're the ones everyone's looking to save them.
Yeah.
Do you think that they see that as now? Do you think they see now as their moment, like to sort of consolidate or kind of constrict their grip on having the upper hand on saying what happens next because of that, Susanna?
I don't know. They're not talking about it right now. It's definitely kind of everyone worried about right now, including their profits. But as I said, I mean, from what I've seen, all the ads I've heard against Medicare for all, like everything's faded. I'm just not seeing the politics around that I was even 3 months ago.
I have a question, but it kind of morphs into two here. And I just wanted to hear your perspective from, someone in the healthcare industry. Do you really see a lot of digital innovation that's going to be able to mitigate coronavirus? And then on top of that, do you see kind of, if that does have an effect, do you see a society shift to more digital even after the coronavirus has peaked, in particularly healthcare?
Like when you say digital, people can call their doctors instead of going to go visit them in person.
Yeah, kind of a variety of stuff from that, like taking your fever and uploading it onto, these websites and all that kind of cool new digital stuff.
So, I mean, I think the big thing that is changing is there were lots of payment rules about whether a doctor would get paid if you called or Skyped him. And then there were rules like with Medicare, if you weren't like in a very rural area to Skype a specialist, you have to go to a different approved doctor's office or Skype. That kind of stuff is getting waived now because obviously they want to keep especially older people in their homes. So that's where I say like incremental stuff is changing quite a bit. I think it'll be hard to roll some of that stuff back. So yeah, I can see more telehealth happening. I mean, that's kind of a big push right now. It's, let's get more people calling their doctor remotely than going to visit. Obviously you can't do that with everything, but there's a lot of urgency about that, especially when people don't want you to leave your home if you think you're sick with coronavirus. So they want people to call and kind of screen before they decide they're going to venture out to get a test.
Do you think it'll stay that way even after, we start to recover from this?
I don't know. I think, as I said, like one thing I will say is I think it'll be hard to make it more stringent and the rules strict again to prevent the payment for that stuff. I'm still unclear because I don't really know many people who use telemedicine. So it's unclear to me how much people use it even now. So I'd have to see a lot of like real numbers to think that's going to change. I mean, would you rather call your doctor than go visit in person? That may be a generational shift too. I know for like my grandmother who goes to see her doctor, it's part of her routine. I don't know if telemedicine would be as effective for some of the more serious things. So I think it depends, but I do think that there was already a push, especially for people in rural areas where doctors were few and far between. There was a push to kind of make this more of a thing. So I see that continuing.
If you could change one thing about the way that healthcare is sort of discussed and debated at sort of a national conversation level, based on kind of your understanding of it, like what would you change?
I would change that everyone always piles on pharma and the insurance companies. But where do a lot of the high bills come from? Come from hospitals and doctors. That's something that Bernie will not address. A lot of Democrats are hesitant to address it. But until you address all the costs and why the costs are there and why so many independent doctors are moving into hospitals, you're not going to solve the coverage problem, because the cost problem will always be there. And the cost problem will prevent any kind of, broad safety net of coverage. So that needs to be talked about. And I just haven't seen that in the more populist conversations at all.
That's a pretty interesting question. That raises my question. You don't have to answer this because it's a big question, but do you make it cheaper or do you give people more money to pay for it? I don't know. I feel like that's at the end of the day, that's the question. That
we pay $3.6 trillion right now.
Yeah.
Do you feel that you're getting your money's worth from $3.6 trillion?
No. No, probably not.
Yeah. And add to that, look at, we have publicly traded, it's a question about the for-profit healthcare system. You have publicly traded hospitals, pharmaceuticals, and insurance companies, and the advocates for that say it pushes efficiency, but it also they're betting against healthcare being cheaper and more affordable because they're betting against an inflated stock price. So, you do have to deal with that, and you have not-for-profit CEOs of both hospitals and insurance companies making $10 to $15 million a year, and that's the not-for-profits. So, there's a lot of money. There's a lot of money in the system, not to mention the armies of consultants, the armies of healthcare lawyers who are here in DC and expensive law firms. You have a lot that's propping up the system as it is. So $3.6 trillion. So I don't know how you start taking some of that money out, and every time there's a big push to do it. There's actually a big bipartisan push last year by Senators Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, who's a Republican, and Patty Murray, who's a Democrat of Washington. They did many experts who really looked at this bill, and they didn't think it had a good chance of passing because it was very wonky. But it did a very serious, sober look, and I went to every single one of their hearings that went on over the course of a year, where they really looked at a lot of issues, from antitrust with hospital systems to anti-competitive behavior to, basic things like if you have workplace insurance and your the insurance company, covering you, gets a really good deal, negotiates, because there are no real prices in healthcare, right? It's all negotiated. And they all say, oh, that's the private market. You can't, interfere with the negotiations. But the problem is then there's no real price. So everything gets, inflated many times depending on who has the negotiating power. So there are clauses that are in place, like a plan doesn't have to tell your company, who's paying for the healthcare, most of it, or you, what they're actually paying for your hospital bill. So the hospital bill can come and you don't know, what they paid, and the insurance company can, collect the balance of what they tell you that they paid the hospital and what they actually pay. That's currently illegal. So that was going to be illegal in the bill. You know who the two people were, the two Democrats who voted against that package were? Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. for various reasons, like it didn't go far enough. But these were such important reforms, and it'll probably now never get to the Senate floor. Maybe in 10 years it will. But it did really threaten these wonky things that really threaten some really bad industry practices that make everything expensive. But you can't get America excited about them because there's no catchy phrase. And because of that, you can't get the politicians to feel any kind of pressure from the public while they're getting pressure from the lobbyists who are giving them money.
Do you think that Bernie Sanders is a working class hero, or do you think that Bernie Sanders is a grumpy old asshole?
I cannot say anything because I'm a reporter and I'm nonpartisan.
Point taken.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Susanna Luthi of Politico, for hanging out and talking to us and answering our questions, regardless of how dumb they are. We very much appreciate it. It was good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you.
Susanna.
Have fun, guys.
Thanks. See you later.
Bye.
All right, boys. That was fun. Walt, what's going on with the markets this week?
Well, so far this week, and we really started this leveling last week where we started to see some stabilization within the markets. Really, we can look at the last 2 months and say that a lot of that big drop would be considered price discovery. So the market was trying to really find where the real value was. And I think so far we found that kind of that level, at least within, we've been trading up and down between a certain 5%. So volatility has gone down a lot in the last week. And for the broad market, that's pretty good. And we haven't seen any big drops. We haven't seen a big gain in an intraday gain. Last week was one of the best days in the market since somewhere in the 1930s, which is really good for the economy. I think that was a lot of recovering from conditions that would be considered oversold. So there was very few sellers left in the market. So you had a lot of kind of young people's money still in the market, and they weren't going to sell, and that was met, right? We found a little bottom there, and it didn't seem like many more people would sell. Today we had a 4%, around 4% intraday move. We were green this morning, but then we closed down, I think, 3% in the red, which, is kind of expected during a pandemic. It's not 12% down, which is good. I would say that these little 5% moves are kind of expected over the next couple of weeks. As far as a big drop coming, I don't foresee one, but you never know. I think the blunt news of 100 to 200,000 people dying would have caused a big drop if something was going to make the market drop, but it didn't. So I think that's really interesting. But again, we have to wait for some real numbers. Companies are going to start reporting, I think, in about a month from this quarter, which will be really interesting.
And well, just earlier today, we started to hear some rumblings about, I was watching in the press conference earlier, about some sort of work happening on infrastructure. Trump was talking about, now that the interest rates are, at 0%, we should be taking out, we should be borrowing against that and investing in, I think he's floated like a $1 trillion infrastructure package, or $2 trillion, something like that. I may be mixing up my numbers, but
yeah, two.
How do you see the market responding to something like that, assuming it actually gets taken up as actual legislation in some way, shape, or form?
Well, yeah. So I saw that tweet this morning from Trump too, and I was kind of confused because it's very much so off topic in what we're going through. I can't speak to what he's thinking about, but there's a couple angles there. There are some good things about that idea. There is one potential that he's just like, okay, capital is cheap. We should do this now. We should spend money because money is free. It's not necessarily free. The 0% isn't really true. We are not at a 0% interest rate. We are 0 to 0.25%. So there will not, at this point, money in the U.S. capital is not free. We're not at 0%. We're in that range somewhere. And particularly in bonds, which would be the way that this debt is offered, it would not be exactly at 0%. So that's not correct. But then jumping off that, he could be playing something off of, the Great Depression, where one of the things that really saved the country was, infrastructure stimulation. So you spend a bunch of money in the U.S. It's called Keynesian economics, which is debt financed growth. And so if you can finance employment, finance investment, and do all these things to stimulate the economy, you can actually use debt to back that. There are some downsides, which would be devaluing your currency, because if you take on a bunch of debt at 0%, that would devalue your currency, because in theory, there's more circulation of that currency within the United States and globally. And that brings up the question of how does that work with China, because China seems to be back on their feet. They have they've been working on generating capital, and they've been investing domestically a lot. And if our government does offer a $2 trillion in debt, does China come in and buy that and own a larger stake in our debt? That's very possible. It could be interesting to see that play out. Trump is also trying, in some ways, I think he is trying to keep up with Xi Jinping, who's the president of China. And Xi Jinping, like 4 years ago, I think, announced the biggest infrastructure bill in the world, which is called the Silk Road Initiative. And that is to connect all of Southeastern Asia and Eastern Europe. And it is a really interesting infrastructure project as far as global economics and everything, because they are colonizing in a lot of ways with capital. So they're going out and offering loans to countries to build their own infrastructure, and those countries will eventually default on those loans. Then China owns that infrastructure. But all that set aside, I think Trump is feeling pressure to catch up to China, because we are actively in negotiations with them for a phase 2 trade deal. And in general, I think the market would see a infrastructure bill as a stimulant, which would be good. And in a lot of ways, if the dollar is driven down in value, that is good for American companies, because that creates more e-commerce, and we can actually, basically sell more iPhones globally if our dollar is cheaper.
Handing them out like Oprah.
Obama phones.
You get an iPhone. You get an iPhone.
I'm excited about Infrastructure Week. I don't know about you guys. I've been waiting a long time for Infrastructure Week. So
we've all been waiting for it. They've been trying to do Infrastructure Week, I think, since week 2 of the administration. And every week it's Infrastructure Week until it isn't.
His first State of the Union, I remember him talking. So he's like, I'm going to get it done next week.
Yeah. No, well, he's a builder. He'll figure it out.
I think the one thing that I was going to say as a closer that I'm just going to be kind of keeping my eye on, especially in the middle of this emergent health crisis we're under, the fact that all of the plausible and non-plausible candidates still in this race are of a higher age bracket, right? We're going to eventually see some VP picks announced. We'll also have kind of a question of whether Mike Pence will be recast in the White House season 2, or whether Trump will pick somebody else. But these VP picks actually matter probably more than any other VP picks that I can think of in past memory, just because of the real possibility that they might actually become president at some point if the elected president becomes incapacitated in some way. I'll be interested to see how they're vetted, if there's more scrutiny over them, and how those picks play into a larger strategy for the different candidates. So are they looking to pick somebody who can step in on the job on day one, and that's kind of the big play. Are they still going the more traditional route of picking an individual who can represent a particular swing state that of value? And will they be riding a wave of kind of popularity, right? So the governor of Michigan is pretty popular right now. I think a couple months ago, you would have seen Kamala Harris pretty highly rated as a potential pick. I think that's still possible, but I'll be interested to see how that gets rolled out and when.
Yeah, Sanders Gabbard. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about that on the next pod, actually. Like, we can talk about who we think the pick would be and why, and we can talk about different strategies that come into play with that, because I think that maybe that will refocus us a little bit on the election, which would be kind of cool. In the meantime, I think a good game to play while you wait for our next pod is one that Brandon and I play quite often, which is pick your dream team president, vice president. So I'll give you an example. Avenatti, Scaramucci, 2020. All right. Come up with the best ones. We'll talk about it next time.
I'll have a list ready for next time. My top 10.
Yeah. Perfect. Brandon Walt, 2020. No, wait. Williamson Palin, 2020.
Williamson, brilliant beaming light of self-actualization, 2020.